Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. I am thrilled that you are here for our panel this afternoon, which is titled Navigating Uncharted Waters, Online Peer Support to Grieving Young Adults Following the Death of a Loved One. I'm State Representative Jessica Benham. I represent the 36th District in Pennsylvania State House, and I am thrilled to be here introducing these wonderful panelists, and later we'll be moderating Q&A. Just as a quick reminder, we don't have continuing education credits for this, couldn't quite get it done this year. And also make sure if you have any questions for our panelists that you go ahead and put that in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be sure to get to those when it's time for Q&A. I'm going to introduce our speakers now. We have Connor Dolly. Connor is currently the Outreach and Education Coordinator at the Highmark Caring Place, where he oversees peer support groups for grieving children and their families. Additionally, Connor works to heighten awareness of children's grief through consultations, presentations, and trainings for professional and community groups. Connor's worked with children and families in the Erie area since 2004, and has a variety of professional and clinical experiences, including working as a child and family specialist, as well as a mental health services supervisor. We also have Janet Arita. Janet is a licensed clinical social worker and a member of the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling. Janet's currently a clinician and child grief specialist, as well as the Outreach and Education Coordinator at the Highmark Caring Place, where she oversees peer support groups for grieving children and their families. Additionally, Janet works to heighten awareness of children's grief through consultations, presentations, and trainings for professional and community groups. We're so excited to have both of you here today to share with us. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much.
I guess I should unmute my mic and share my screen, right?
I'm going to go off camera and I'll come back on when it's my turn.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Connor Dolly. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Highmark Caring Place in Erie. And our presentation is Navigating Uncharted Waters, Online Peer Support for Grieving Young Adults Following the Death of a Loved One. During our time together today, we'll be talking about ways of supporting grieving young adults. We invite you to make yourself comfortable, move around and take breaks when you need to. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A so that they can be addressed at the end. And most importantly, be kind to yourself. Know that we're talking about grief and mourning, and that can stir up some feelings. So please honor whatever is coming up for you and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. There will be at least one opportunity for you to participate today, as we know that all of you have so much lived experience and expertise. So we invite you to participate in whatever way is most comfortable for you, either sharing in the chat or just reflecting to yourself. What we hope that you get out of today's presentation is understanding the experience of grief for young adults, identifying unique difficulties of grief during young adulthood, and discussing ways of giving and receiving support as a grieving young adult. We'll also share our experience. Jan and I both have led grief support groups for young adults, and we'll share that experience as well. We're both coming from the Highmark Caring Place. Janet's outside of Pittsburgh in Warrendale. I'm a little bit more north in Erie. The Highmark Caring Place is a grief support center that provides peer support groups at no charge for children, teens, and their families. Historically, we have done this in 4 brick and mortar buildings across the Commonwealth, but since the pandemic, we have transitioned to offering all of our support virtually. Our virtual groups are for kids from preschool, so we're talking probably like 3 years old, through high school and their adult family members. And if anyone is interested in our peer support groups, they can look at our website at highmarkcaringplace.com/contact to reach out to us for more information. And we have tons of info on our site. And recently, we've also started virtual young adult grief support groups. Our next one is starting in June. Jan's actually working in one right now. That's wrapping up probably the end of this month. So before we jump into this, let's make sure we're using the same language. Who is it that we're thinking of when we're speaking of young adults? And one way to think of that age group is thinking about Erik Erikson's theoretical model of human development. Young adulthood is the sixth stage when the primary developmental task is intimacy versus isolation. And typically that happens between the ages of 19 and 40, but this is very fluid. There's nothing magical about these numbers. It's more about where people are developmentally and what tasks they're facing in their lives. So we're thinking about what happens during young adulthood and what are young adults contending with. These are more generalities when it comes to what young adults are dealing with in this life stage. And so we're thinking about leaving home. They are gaining more independence. It's the time when they're going to college, they're moving out, they are getting their first apartment. Their brain is still developing actively. And what we've learned from science and studies is that that's typically active through 26, but you're always learning, you're always developing your brain. But it's really active in this age group. Life-altering decisions being made, whether it's exploring different careers, educational opportunities, trying to balance life with these new responsibilities, including financial responsibilities like paying rent, insurance, for paying for food or heat. There are shifts in peer relationships, whether you're moving geological regions, or now spending more time with colleagues and less time with your childhood friends. And focus is now on moving forward. And so as we're thinking about these young adults, this is the stuff that's happening. And then on top of it all, we're going to talk more about grief, compounding that grief to that. So we have all those experiences, and now we have these complicated feelings that young adults are having. And this is pretty general across the board, worrying about school or work responsibilities, worrying about family, worrying about relationships or our future, feeling guilty that I'm away from home or not spending time with people, feeling shame about not being able to keep up or keep in step with my peers, or comparing myself to my peers. All this can lead to a sense of loneliness that they're in between peer groups or in life transitions. Support system isn't here for me right now, and nobody around me supports me because they don't know me. And so there's that feeling of loneliness. Confusing to manage all of this, right? There's all this confusion around that. These new demands, these new feelings, these limited resources, and a fear of the unknown and all of this change. Feeling overwhelmed with these new responsibilities. And so imagine adding grief, this grief overlay onto all of these feelings and these complicated feelings, these experiences that these young adults are going through, just by being in this life stage. And so you might be wondering, is this really a big problem? I mean, grief with young adults, how relevant is this? And so here are some facts, and I'll just pull them all up. In terms of adverse life events, death loss is the most common for undergraduates, cited more often than experiences such as parental divorce, traumatic sexual and violent acts, and academic problems. And we're talking about grief. We're talking about 1 in 3 college students will grieve a death of someone close to them in the last year, and 35 to 48%. So almost, a third to a half of college students are within 2 years of grieving a loved one. And that number increases as they get older. So, I mean, we're looking at the youngest of the young adult population, that number is actually going to increase in time. And over 10% of young adults will have grieved a death of a parent, which, if you think about, even if you're at work or in a classroom and you look at how many people are in that classroom, if I'm in a class of 25, there's at least mathematically 2 young adults in that classroom who have grieved a death of a parent. And half to a third are grieving someone close to them within the last 2 years of that death. And ironically, though, this life stage, because they are grieving and they're going through all this and they're feeling very alone in that, this age group has been hard to reach. While a lot of young adults would benefit from support, it's hard for individuals in this age group to get the support they need. Often the support isn't available for this age group. They're not teens and they don't fit in with the supports that age group is getting. And so they might join a support group for adults, but still feel all alone in that everyone is older than me. And it's just not the same. I'm not getting the same support. People of my age don't get it. And part of the reason is because they can be a difficult population to engage. If you think about it, often they are living independently for the first time, trying to juggle responsibilities at work, school, second jobs, relationships, all these expectations. And with that, they're just not making grief a priority. We were actually working with a young adult, Jan and I, who told us that she was thankful that we had a group for her to join because it allowed her to schedule time in her week to grieve. Now I'm going to send it to Janet, who's going to share more about grieving young adults.
Thanks, Connor. So just sort of picking up where Connor left off, I just want to kind of invite you to think about what the stage of young adulthood represents. So as you see in this graphic image, it's sort of a time in life that's characterized by a lot of choice points. One of the biggest of these is the decision about whether to go to college after high school or whether to join the workforce, and whether those decisions will take people away from home or keep them close to home. So that's a normative decision for all young adults to be faced with. And then when we stir in loss as an added ingredient, or as Connor said, kind of an overlay that's superimposed on this, you can see how complicated this stage of life can be for young adults. So for those young adults who choose to go to college, they are sort of faced with a multitude of challenges if they're also grieving. They're facing potentially geographic distance from home, so having relocated to an environment that feels unfamiliar to them. They have lost the routines and the things that oriented them in their everyday life. When kids are in high school, there are a lot of external structures that kind of hold them in place, and a lot of outside decision makers in terms of what every day looks like and what assignments are due and how they need to manage them. And their parents decide usually, what the day at home looks like and when meals are served and all of the rest of it. And now suddenly they're in a place where they have a lot of autonomy over all those sorts of decisions, and a lot of unstructured time. And that can be difficult to manage when you're also grieving. There are all sorts of new demands, academic pressures that maybe they haven't faced before. And all of this is happening when they've suddenly, maybe for the first time, lost their access to the usual supports that were in place in their lives, whether that be a favorite teacher, a school counselor, family members, close friends that they've known all of their lives. This is often a time when all of those things kind of scatter in different directions, and kids are left to face the reality of not quite having the skills to know how to move forward and not quite having the skills to know how to access new supports. If they have gone to a new place and started college, they may have started to make friends, but these may be sort of untested friendships. They may function really well at the superficial level of, roommates getting along or classmates sharing study time. They may not quite yet be the kind of friends that people really want to take into their confidence and share a really important thing like a major loss or the experience of grief with. This can lead to them feeling very out of sync with their peers, and just sort of not doing all of the other things. The major concerns for college students are friendships and academic responsibilities and connecting socially. And when you're grieving, oftentimes those things fall farther down on your radar. You're really focused on just trying to manage getting through the day, and how to sort out meeting any academic demands with kind of all of the emotional experience that's unfolding in your head. So that can make them feel really out of sync with the people that are surrounding them. As you all know, on college campuses, there's often fairly easy access to substances, alcohol, and other things. And so people in this age group may turn to substances as a form of coping. And that can often not be very helpful. So as I bring up the next slide, you're going to see a clip from a man named Dr. David Fajgenbaum. We were fortunate enough to spend some time with him last November in celebration of Children's Grief Awareness Day. Some of my colleagues conducted an interview with him, and he is a young physician who has spent a lot of his life doing research on rare diseases. In part, that was triggered by the fact that he himself has dealt with a rare disease. And he's also no stranger to grief in that he lost his mother during his own college years. She developed brain cancer and she died while he was in college. And so in this very short clip that we're about to see, he's going to describe what that experience was like for him.
So I learned just a couple weeks after I got to college that my mom was diagnosed with brain cancer, and of course was just devastated to learn of her diagnosis, and just struggled so much with learning that my best friend, my mom, was going to be so sick, and watching her illness. She battled brain cancer for 15 months. And throughout that time, I traveled back and forth between college and spending time with her, but really felt completely alone. As you said, it was this feeling that everyone else is a freshman at college and they're all having fun. And it's just, and I, not only was I not having fun, I felt guilty if I ever did have fun. If I ever smiled, I was like, how could I smile? My mom is back home getting chemotherapy. And
so just in that little glimpse, I think he really was able to share what it's like to be in college and to be surrounded by people who have much different concerns than the concerns that you're carrying around. And those can be really weighty and really difficult to know how to manage when you're, 18 or 20 or even 21 years old. You really don't have the life skills or the experience to know what to do with all of that. And it's pretty difficult to be surrounded by people who really can't relate to those concerns. So for young adults who choose not to go to college and who enter the workforce directly, they're also facing their own set of challenges and demands. Again, their choice may have taken them to places that are geographically distant from their family and their friends and other sources of support. They're learning a new job, and so they're faced with all the challenges that go along with that learning curve. Grieving notoriously kind of robs us of our energy, our creativity, our ability to concentrate, to innovate. And so all of those things are diminished at the very time when a new job is kind of requiring us to perform at our highest level and become our best selves. So that can be a very difficult mismatch between the demands of our life and the resources that we're able to bring to it. Again, we may have difficulty finding supports. If we've relocated, that can be its own challenge. But even when we haven't, many of our friends may have gone off to college and other places, and we may just not be surrounded by the people that we've relied on throughout our lives. In addition, we might be juggling multiple demands. Oftentimes, one job is not enough to make ends meet, and so we may have multiple jobs. It's a lot to contend with while grief is sort of unfolding in the background. And again, substance use is also a problem in this age group among people who are working, especially once they're over 21 and there's more legal access to substances. But sometimes that's the path of least resistance, maybe, that people turn to when they're not quite sure what else to do with all the feelings that they're having. So these are some of the themes that we experienced while working with young adults and that can also be found in the literature. So as we've already alluded to, just that feeling of being out of sync and feeling alone and set apart from the people who are in their peer group and who are surrounding them. They're often feeling a need to remain connected to and find ways to memorialize the person who has died. And we live in a culture that often doesn't support that. Young adults often feel like they've had to grow up much sooner than they might otherwise, particularly if they've lost a parent. They may feel the need to step into that parent's role, help out the surviving parent, simply because they look like an adult and they're walking around an adult's body doesn't mean that they know how to function as an adult or that they're not going to be profoundly impacted by the grief that they're experiencing. They often don't know other grieving people in their age group. So even though Connor showed us that slide with the statistics and we know what a significant and prevalent problem this is, just because of the culture that we live in where there's not a lot of space or permission to talk about grief, people often don't know or appreciate the others who are grieving around them. I'm sure you've all seen some version of the Facebook meme about how we never know the stories that other people are carrying. And I think it's very true when we think about grief. We really don't know what lost stories people are carrying around. And so oftentimes we all just carry our own stories around. And that makes us unavailable to support others who may have a very similar story, but we're just not sharing. Similarly, the way that we communicate about grief in our culture seems to suggest that grief can be sort of a neat and manageable process that unfolds maybe in a stepwise fashion, that it has some predictability. And we know that grief rarely looks that way. And so the kind of expectations that we might enter a period of grief with and the reality that we're met with can have a pretty wide gap between them. And in that gap can live all sorts of disappointment and confusion and despair. We've already talked about some of the life transition challenges and how those interact with grief. People at this age, developmentally are able to hold very abstract realities and multiple truths at the same time. And a loss of this magnitude can lead to some pretty profound existential questions about who they are, what the purpose of life is, how will they move forward into the future, all those sorts of things. So it can be a time of spiritual turmoil and reckoning. It can be really important for young adults at this stage to have a mentor to connect with. And not only professionally and academically, but also kind of a life mentor, someone who's willing to be pretty transparent about any struggles that they may have faced and to make space for this young person to share kind of the rawness of their own struggles as they're living through them. And just a place where they can absorb the life lessons that other people have learned. They often have very powerful and surprising grief reactions. These can be triggered by really unexpected things like, a special day or a song or the smell of the rain in spring. It's just really unpredictable, but often people are blindsided by the intensity of the feelings that might come rushing at them when they least expect them. And so it's really important for them to be able to find support in their community and to recognize that no matter how supportive their family may have been historically, it may be a time just because of changes that have happened as a result of the death, where family members may not be able to support each other in quite the same ways that they used to before. And that may change over time, but it's important to recognize that that can sometimes be a source of disappointment as well. So the journey of grief, if we can call it that, rather than being something that sort of neatly and predictably unfolds in one direction, is instead something that is much kind of slower and like a layer by layer unfolding process. And we live in a culture that is very oriented toward fast food, disposable items, things that happen quickly and can be checked off a list. We don't easily make space for things that unfold in a gradual and incremental way. And grief is very much that. It is something that has many layers. It's quite unpredictable. It can't be rushed. It needs its own time and space in which to unfold. And so young adults who are experiencing this find themselves very much at odds with kind of the pace of our culture as it tends to unfold. So with that, I am going to shift back to Connor and let him take us a little bit further on this journey together.
Thank you, Janet. So what does grief look like in young adults? For a lot of young adults, they're grieving their first significant loss in their life. They didn't know what to expect as far as how that could impact them. For some other young adults, a recent death might trigger memories and emotions of an impactful death that they were grieving from when they were younger. And add that to everything Janet mentioned as far as all the other life changes with this age group, and with leaving home, entering the workforce, all these life losses and transitions, and adding grief, it truly compounds. So with all grievers, young adults can experience their grief across all dimensions of their lives. They may have a lack of energy and motivation, just going through the motions, neglecting themselves as they focus on their duties or their task at hand, feeling isolated, being poorly understood by others. We had a young adult tell us how his friend just stopped inviting him to things. They felt awkward around him, and so he was angry about the death of his dad, and his friends didn't know how to act around him, so they just stopped being around him. Inability to focus, concentrate, or integrate new learnings, need for additional time and support, changes in study habits, lower academic performance and achievement, emotional, difficulty relegating emotions and managing feelings of sadness and irritability, and developmentally, a sense of being stuck or out of sync with your peers, feeling like all of my friends are moving on, graduating, getting jobs, getting married, and I'm still living at my dad's house because I need to be here for my mom. Developmental tasks of, what am I trying to say here? Trying to hurry. Developmental tasks of turning gaze outward, moving away from home and family, and the complex feelings that can be elicited when a death occurs during this time. Grieving is at odds with the normal growth trajectory of moving forward at this age. Shifting support expectations from family to peers can be derailed when peers are not able to provide this support. Identifying and establishing oneself as an adult. Is needing, wanting supports allowed as an adult? I'm expected to be able to handle these things. And so, yikes, these are the expectations, and these are the things that young adults are struggling with. It's important to consider cultural and social influences, such as ethnicity, if they're a first generation college student, if they're going to work instead of going to college. And then also the nature of loss. Was it anticipated or unexpected? Was it tragic or violent? Was it stigmatized or disenfranchised? Because that also plays a role in their grief. For some who are expecting a death, they may have been grieving their loved one for months before the death even occurred. And that doesn't diminish the grief, but it just may look different. So when a loss is sudden or traumatic or violent, we were working with a young adult whose brother died unexpectedly. She was at work when she found them, and her family was trying to reach her, and she got a hold of her coworker, and the emotional breakdown that she had, the feelings of regret. I wish we would have spent more time together. I wish last time I was home, I would have had lunch with him instead of going shopping with my friends. Why did this have to happen to me? Could I have done something different to prevent this? How do I avoid letting the means of death overshadow this person's life? And then grief may be unrecognized or delegitimized, which could disenfranchise or stigmatize the death. So if it were a friend or a classmate or a roommate, or an online relationship, or an ex, or a step parent, or a foster parent, or someone that they loved that was incarcerated, or a miscarriage, or pregnancy loss, or abortion, or even a celebrity or internet personality, people grieve those losses. They're all very important losses to people. And grief may result just being not accepted culturally or socially, right? You may grieve a death or a non-death loss. It could be a life-altering illness that someone has, and so they've just changed, or the hopes and the desires to do something with someone might have changed. The breakup, separation, divorce, mental illness, substance abuse, religious conversion, estrangement. People grieve those losses. Feeling of shame, fear of being judged, because stigma is attached to either a relationship, such as maybe a same-sex partner or an affair partner, or a means of death, the suicide, a homicide, an overdose. Those can be judged as well. And so the expression of grief is seen as socially or culturally unacceptable, often with losses like this. And simply being cut off, on top of that, simply being cut off from needed social support can also result in a loss being disenfranchised. And we were working with someone named Jamie, who gave us this quote. I found it so meaningful to be able to share my grief story with other young adults closer to my age. We're at the same stage in life with similar thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Those connections helped my grief by knowing I'm not alone. And so when you have a group of young adults who are going through something very similar and feeling that they're alone in their grief and feeling that their loss is disenfranchised, and or feeling guilty or alone, and you're sitting in a room virtually and with others who get it, others who are going through something very similar, it's really comforting. So how can we support young adults who are grieving? So using the chat function, this is our chat for the day. What ways have you found to support grieving young adults in your life? I think we have a chat function. Do we have a chat? Yeah, there it is.
I don't believe attendees have an option.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So we took off the chat function for attendees. I don't know if you have any examples you may want to use.
Sure.
Or you could use.
Yeah, well, we're going to cover all of that. Thank you. I didn't know we turned the chat off. I apologize for that. So I guess think about some ways that maybe you have found to support grieving young adults in your life, and we'll talk about some ways that we've been able to support grieving young adults. What we have found, and we have mentioned this in past webinars, is that we cannot fix this. It doesn't just go away. We can never get to this acceptance stage, right? We've heard of the stages of grief where we get to this acceptance, and people call us and even say, hey, I'd like to just be done grieving. But we can't get there, right? We'll be grieving this death differently throughout our life. And so the best thing to do when we're supporting someone who's grieving, especially a grieving young adult, is just be available, be there for them. Allow them to feel what they're feeling. It's okay to feel angry or sad, and be present with them. If they're opening up, the last thing they want is for you to be distracted. There are so many options for support. The most common ones are individual counseling, group counseling, peer support groups, online support groups, social media pages such as Facebook groups where everyone in the group is grieving a death. There's different podcasts that talk about grief and help you understand your feelings and know that you aren't alone. There's bibliotherapy, so many good books out there to support grieving people, and tons of other support options that I'm sure you could all rattle off in the chat that we aren't even thinking of, but not the chat because the chat's turned off, so you're thinking it. And the nice thing is it's not like people can choose one of these options. You can choose multiple. A lot of these complement each other. You can listen to a podcast, read a book, be on a Facebook group, attend a peer support group, either virtually or in person, and attend counseling. And if that is the level of support that you need at this time, that is great that you can do that. And later, you might not need that same level, and something else might be the support option that's a better fit for you. Some benefits to therapy. There are some amazing benefits for therapy for someone who's grieving a death. One, at least in individual counseling, the focus is on you. There's a treatment plan that you and your clinician work on together. The support you are getting in therapy is more clinical. I know Janet and I are both licensed clinicians, and how we would approach a counseling session versus facilitating a peer support group, and the things I might say and the things that we might bring up are very different. There's also online support, which is very beneficial, especially during this COVID age. It's become instrumental in supporting grieving individuals. The nice thing is it's easy. You can be sitting on your couch, pull up your phone or your tablet, and boom, you're there. Signing up is easy, getting on is easy, and the support you're getting can be from anywhere in the world. And so a couple examples for young adults that you see, the Dinner Party and healgrief.org are they offer a lot of great resources for young adults virtually. And then there's other entities like ourselves, the Highmark Caring Place, Actively Moving Forward, the Dougy Center. We're all providing support and our resources for young adults. And there's others as well besides the three of us. And now Janet's gonna bring us home. She's gonna talk to you about what peer support looks like.
Thanks, Connor. And I am paying attention to time, so I realize that we have only about 10 minutes until we're ready to open up for questions. So I will try to move through this relatively quickly. I'm going to share with you from our own experience at the Highmark Caring Place in providing virtual support groups for young adults. So we'll just get started with that. Next slide, please. So the first thing I just want to talk about is the idea of how we designed our virtual support groups. So we wanted to, we knew we couldn't meet in person for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which was COVID, but also because this age group has been historically difficult to reach. And so a virtual approach, even not during a pandemic, has been really effective in working with young adults. So we wanted to offer them the benefit of being connected to their peers, and doing so in an online format allows them to access with a maximum of convenience and a minimum of barriers. We also designed the groups to be unfolding over 8 sessions. That was a manageable chunk of time for people to commit to, and so it made uptake a little bit easier for people. So just in the interest of time, I think I'm not going to say more about that. I'm going to talk a little bit, though, about how the group unfolded over the 8 meeting nights. So, there are some general principles that we think about when we're designing groups, sort of the way that groups unfold in terms of the group forming and developing kind of a group identity, creating the safety and the trust that's necessary to really start sharing grief stories. So that was really the beginning sessions were what we focused on, really getting to know one another, creating a safe space, developing some group agreements for how we would talk safely with one another. And after that sort of container was built, we moved into a place where we could explore some feelings and made room for kind of all the feelings that go along with grief. And there are just a multitude of feelings. I'm sure, again, if the chat were enabled, we could have you list hundreds in probably less than 3 minutes. And our group members are able to do that as well. From hurt and anger and confusion and overwhelm to relief and sadness and guilt and all sorts of things. So those are the things that we work with over the next few weeks of group. We make a lot of space for people to share their stories, their lost stories, as well as just their general stories of the people they love who died, because we know that while death ends a relationship, while death ends a person's life, it doesn't end the relationship with that person. And so people still want us to get to know their loved one. They still want that person to be carried forward in their own lives. And so we make a lot of room for those stories, for them to share mementos, for them to share stories, photographs, all sorts of things. And we really talk very intentionally about the very natural desire to create and maintain connections with our loved ones who have died. And how will that look as our lives unfold? How will we move forward in the world and carry those connections that we have to our loved ones with us as we live out our own lives? And then as the group gets ready to draw to a close, we make sure that we talk about coping strategies that the group has found effective. We can suggest things if they don't naturally come up as part of the discussion. What supports might they be able to tap into? Just really emphasizing the importance of self-care. And then we always close with a special ritual that's designed to really kind of cement the connectedness between group members and the connection that each group member has to their loved one who dies. And although the group ends after 8 sessions, there's nothing that prevents the group members from staying connected to one another. And because this age group is so tech savvy, they tend very early on to exchange contact information. They typically have a group chat. Sometimes they have like a group Zoom call. So there are all sorts of options for them. And really, we take our role as facilitators pretty seriously. So we really help build the container for the group. We hold the space. We provide support and guidance, but we really facilitate the connections between the group members. And those are things that they're free to continue indefinitely. So at the very beginning of group, we ask them to share what their hopes and expectations might be for what they would hope to get from the group and what they hope to bring to the group. So these are some of the things that people said, that they wanted to know they weren't alone, that their experience was that people their own age just didn't get it. And they had a hard time talking to people. They experienced that there was some outpouring of support at the funeral, but afterwards, some of that disappeared. As Connor talked about earlier, there was one group member in particular that comes to my mind, but this theme was expressed by a lot of group members of just the importance of having this set apart time to really do explicit grief work. And the importance of the connections with one another. So one of the most important and powerful quotes that I'll end with for this slide is just one participant who said, "I used to live life in color, and now it's in black and white," speaking of what it was like, their life before the loss of their loved one, and then after the death. So these are the ways they felt coming into group. Then group started, and this is just a sample of some of the activities that we do in group. We're pretty mindful within each group night to have a certain structure where we have kind of an opening and a check-in and then like a closing. So we typically checked in using certain things that I'm going to show you in the next slide. We used word clouds for various purposes. We did provide some psychoeducation, just as we mentioned about some of the misperceptions that we have culturally about what grief should look like. We did things like allowing them to write letters to their loved ones, using poems, quotes, and journal prompts. For some groups, music was really important, and they chose to make playlists or things like that of their favorite songs or their songs who reminded them of their loved ones who had died. And then we always talked about what we call the 3 C's. So challenges, changes, and coping strategies. And finally, each group night we ended with a closing ritual. So now I'm just going to show you a couple of samples. So this was a check-in. This was a sample check-in. And for those of you who might not know, this is Dave Grohl. He was in Nirvana and later started the band Foo Fighters. And so you can find a lot of these online, and they're just sort of little ways of checking in. How are you feeling today? 1 through 9. The thing I like about these is that they don't have any label, any emotion label attached to them. So it's really a matter of interpretation. And people can choose, like I'm feeling a 3 today, they might say. And then you can say, well, would you like to share why? And then they'll tell you what 3 means to them. And it's amazing the diversity of perception of what 3 might mean to one person and what 8 might mean to another person. So it's pretty enlightening. It's a nice way to check into the group. We tend to use lighter, more icebreaker ones at the beginning of an 8-week group. And as we move further into the group, we might use check-ins that are a little bit more probing and might lead to a more rich discussion. So check-ins can be used in all sorts of different ways. This is a word cloud. This particular word cloud came from an activity that we call last word or one word. And it was a checkout activity that we used at the end of group, just at the end of each group night. So we would ask the group members if they would like to provide one word that summed up how they were feeling at the end of group that evening. And over the course of the 8 weeks, we collected these words, and we created this word cloud. You'll notice that there's a difference in the size of the words. So words that appeared more than one time are larger than words that appear. So in other words, the size represents how frequently the word appeared, is what I'm trying awkwardly to say. So hopeful and reflective were offered really often. Digesting, drained, some of those other words maybe occurred only one time. But this particular word cloud, as I said, was from a checkout activity, but they can also be used really effectively for feelings or to explore triggers of grief or things that people use as comforts and supports. The word clouds have a multitude of uses when doing group work with most ages, but we're really effective with the young adult groups. I think most importantly is just the opportunity to share stories. And so there's just so many times when we hear from our young adults that there's no place else that they can really share the fullness of their story. We had one young woman in particular that comes to mind who was in one of our groups. She had actually attended our conventional programming at the Caring Place building prior to COVID, and she attended with a sibling. And she was placed in an adult group because technically she was an adult, she was a young adult. But the concerns that the other adults in the room, many of whom might have lost a spouse or a child, were very different than the concerns that she had as a young adult who was supporting a younger sibling. And so when she came back through the Caring Place in the young adult group, she noticed the striking difference in the way that the group met her needs because everyone was in her age group dealing with similar issues. So that, just making a place to share stories and the resonance between stories is really striking in this group.
I just wanted to pop in here real quick. Because
talking.
I have really enjoyed this, but we are getting to the point where we just have to stop and take some questions here. But your presentation has really been incredible. We've got a few questions here. The first one was there was a doctor that was mentioned, and I think somebody wanted that information to potentially be shared.
Sure. That is Dr. David Fajgenbaum, and his last name is spelled Fejgenbaum.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, he wrote the book called Chasing My Cure. So if you go to Amazon and search him, he'll pop up, and then you'll see like his name spelling and some books that he's written.
Perfect. And then another question that we had was about how do we make sure that these services are accessible to folks who are un or underinsured?
Oh, that's a great question that we didn't address. Connor, do you want to respond to that one?
Sure. So at least with us, we don't bill or charge for any of the services that we provide. So we're a free program for the entire community. So for young adults, for our young adult groups, we're servicing young adults from across the country. we've had young adults mainly on like the eastern part of the states. In the last couple groups we had people in like Brooklyn and Maryland. But for our other support groups are with the kids and the adults, we're primarily staying in Pennsylvania within driving distance to our 4 locations, but it's free. So you don't have to worry about being billed or double billing or anything. It's a free program.
We're supported financially by the Highmark Caring Foundation, so that enables us to offer everything for free, which we feel really fortunate to be able to do.
Yes.
That was going to be my follow-up question was how are you funded? So thank you for preemptively saying that. I think another question that we have here is, for a lot of folks, seeking any kind of treatment or therapy comes with stigma. And so how do we make sure that we are encouraging people who have to overcome that additional barrier of stigma to receive services?
Sure. I think that's a great question, Connor. If you have something to say, I'll defer to you, or else
You can go first. If I have anything to add, I'll add it.
Okay. So at the current moment, because of the pandemic restrictions, we're providing everything virtually, which essentially eliminates all stigma because people can be in their living rooms and nobody knows that they're receiving any kind of support. So in the short term and for the next several months, that's the answer to my question, is that it's very easy to access services virtually. However, once we do get back to brick and mortar providing services, we do have 4 locations across the Commonwealth. As Connor mentioned, we have Warrendale, where I work, and Erie, where he works. And then we have downtown Pittsburgh and Harrisburg area. And all of those sites are available. And the way that we provide our services are in the form of peer support groups that happen in the evenings at our sites, and families come there together. The whole family attends, and there are groups for kids, groups for teens, and groups for adults. So we have like a dinner hour where everybody socializes and eats together, and we provide dinner for free. And then people go to their respective age appropriate groups. And it really is not counseling or therapy. It is very much a peer support model. So it's pretty low key. They're all in like freestanding buildings that don't look like hospitals or any sort of service provision location. So I think we've done as much as we can to reduce any stigma that people might otherwise feel. I don't know if that's a perfect answer, but that's the best one I could come up with.
I'm not sure there is a perfect answer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Connor, what were you going to add?
No, I mean, I agree. There's no perfect answer, but I think that was good, Jane. I'll just add to that. I mean, as far as like just supporting people in your community or at work or at school, if you know that people are struggling with grief, encourage them to, seek support, because that right there like helps with the stigma. But if they're not ready, if they're not open to it at this time, I mean, it's okay, not pushing it, but just allowing them to know that we're a resource in the community and we're here when they're ready for us.
Yeah, I think that's really important. There's so much work that we have to do to reduce stigma. I think it's important to, to see, for example, a princess on television talk about mental health and the difficulty of seeking treatment is huge.
Yes.
I always say, everyone should be in therapy, but more elected officials should be in therapy. I think we would see better laws and better debate and better services to our constituents if more of us were. And, for myself as a very busy person, virtual therapy has been incredible. It saves me about an hour of time commuting to and from, or I could be in therapy when I'm in Harrisburg with my therapist back here. So for me, it's an issue of convenience, but I can definitely see for folks who are concerned about stigma that should be a thing too. But I think the more we speak openly about handling grief in community with our peers and with professional help, the less stigma we will see.
Yes, that's very true. And if I could just add one more thing, even once we go back to providing in-person services, we do intend to keep another track of virtual services. So there should still be a virtual offering available for people who might really be put off by the idea that going to a place has stigma attached to it, and they can continue to participate from their living rooms. So
that's fantastic. Options, I think, are great. something to fit everybody's needs. And speaking of options, we have another question here. What do you all think about text therapy? It seems like a lot of young people especially are choosing to use things like Talkspace. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I know that those platforms exist, and I can't speak to any one of them over another one of them from a professional standpoint. I have to trust that they're in some way properly vetted and monitored and only hire licensed therapists and all the rest of it. So all of that aside, and assuming that they're doing their own important work of making sure they're delivering a quality service, my personal thought is that anything that increases availability of supportive services to people is potentially a good thing. Like anything, it has the potential to be misused or inadequately used, or, there's a downside with everything. So I don't think I can say a ringing endorsement of them, but I do think that for people who maybe it's more cost effective, or it's less stigmatized, or it's more accessible, I think all of those are good things. So I don't know if you have thoughts beyond that, Connor.
No, that was my answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Always nice when someone else covers it for you.
We're
So if I'm
usually of
hearing
the same
correctly,
So
you're basically saying, well, it's probably better than nothing. You don't have, much personal experience with it. We don't know about vetting. And I think those are really valid questions. And I've seen too, the emergence of like texting lines for folks with like suicide prevention and things like that. And that again seems like, better than nothing, potentially very accessible. But I agree. Certainly concerns about oversight and qualifications. I think that was all of our questions. So if both of you want to offer kind of a closing thought, some key takeaways in the few minutes that we have left, I think we've got 3 minutes or so, then we can kind of close.
I don't know, Jan, do you want me to share a slide, or are you good?
Let's not pull the slides back up. It's okay. I mean, there wasn't a lot left to do. There were like 2 slides left. So I think just what I'll say is that I think, part of our mission at the Caring Place is to provide direct services to grieving individuals. And the young adults are kind of our newest population that we've begun to serve directly. But, we recognize that grief affects people from birth to death, and that everybody is entitled to grief support. So a big part of our work and our mission is providing that direct support. But I think an overarching part of our mission is really to change the way we talk about grief in our culture, and to elevate the conversation and to reduce stigma, and just all the things that we've been talking about in this question and answer session. Those are things that we feel really passionate about. And you can see how providing direct support would nest underneath that larger kind of cause. But everybody on this call, everybody who's a human can play a role in that. It's not just professionals and organizations. There are lots of ways to educate ourselves about how to create a more grief-friendly culture, how to do our own grief work so that we can help support other people in doing theirs. There's one particular YouTube video that I can recommend that's called How to Support a Grieving Friend by Megan Devine. She wrote, "It's okay to not be okay," or "It's okay not to be okay." It's something like that. She has a podcast. There are lots of TED Talks about grief. There are lots of grief-related podcasts. And I know that talking about grief isn't like the most, some people want to run in the other direction when they hear about that we're talking about grief. So first of all, I just want to commend all the people that are listening to this presentation, because grief is a thread that connects all of us. It's something that we can't escape. It's something that everyone will experience in their lives. And so the more we take it on head on, the more we allow it to kind of soften us as people and make us more available to others, I think the more we make the world a safer place for everyone. Okay, sorry, I took a lot of the time. I'm going to stop.
That's all right. That's all right. I just want to thank everyone for coming and giving us this opportunity to speak on this topic. Janet and I are part of the outreach and education team for the Highmark Caring Place, and we do monthly webinars. And actually, our next one is May 5th from 2 to 3:30. And Janet will be on that one along with Alexa Livelsberger, who is from our Harrisburg office. And this is the image for that one, the smell of rain when grief arrives like an unexpected storm. So if anyone's interested in registering for that one, you can go to bit.ly, the bit.ly/grief talk smell rain.
And they're totally free,
Yes.
just so you know. Everything we do is free. And that's also could be found on our website, highmarkcaringplace.com, or our Facebook page, Highmark Caring Place. So there are lots of different ways that you can access that sign up information.
Wonderful. Well, I am so grateful. I feel like I learned so much from listening to both of you today. So thank you for sharing your presentation. Thank you everyone who came and who submitted questions. I was so excited to learn and to moderate this panel. So we will look forward to seeing most folks tomorrow for additional panels. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks for your excellent moderation and for keeping us on track, which I clearly needed help with.
It's tough, especially in the virtual world. It's a little easier, I think, in person.
Yeah, it's easier to read the room when you can actually see it. So, yeah.
Absolutely.